Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our COVID midweek update of the 3rd of November. So goodness, we're coming to the end of our second year of COVID. Wow, time certainly is flying. Let me get into share screen. I'm disabled. I don't seem to be able to share my screen. We've got a bit of a technical problem. Let me just try again. Yeah, got it. All right, so all our parameters are certainly looking very good. All the indicators are looking good. If we look at the, okay, there we are. Over the last 24 hours, 169 new cases. That's pretty low. I guess it's one of the lowest that I can remember. There's a minuscule amount of virus around, but certainly we are in a very good space and the indicators are very positive. The Hatsola data, no cases over the last week, the week ending the 29th of October. So that's new. That's good news. And our curve is certainly now, let me get a pointer up here. The curve is now starting to flatten out. And as I pointed out last week, if we look at the curve where we are now, this is the lowest it's been basically since the pandemic started. So yeah, we're doing pretty well. And looking at the percentage positivity of cases of the laboratory tests, 1.2%, the lowest since the pandemic started. All of that looking very good, low virus transmission, low activity where we are at the moment. Vaccination, not quite so optimistic. 167,000, 168,000 over the last 24 hours. That is disappointing. We were really hoping to get over 200,000. I think now we really need to get 250,000 per day if we're going to vaguely try and get to our target. Well, we won't get our target of 70% of the adults by the end of this year. That's going to flow into next year. But really, we do need to up the amount of vaccines being administered, particularly to the adults and particularly the older adults. If you look at the adolescents, the teenagers, 12 to 17 years, also pretty low, disappointing, 156,000 doses only being administered to the adolescents or the teenagers. That's pretty low. We really have a lot of homework to do before we can really start getting good vaccination coverage. In the older age group, the 60 plus, 63% have been vaccinated, mainly fully vaccinated, some partially vaccinated. The 50 to 59-year-old group, 56.34%. Still quite a significant gap that we do need to try and fill. The Western Cape still leading at 47%, and us in Gauteng, we're trailing behind, unfortunately. If we look a bit more closely, sorry, we seem to be going. Yeah, if we look a bit more closely at the older age group of those that have been fully vaccinated, 55% of the 60 plus and the 50 to 59. So this is the critical kind of age group where we really need to kind of up our game and get more and more of that group vaccinated. These are the high risk group, the group that if we do have another wave or when we do have another wave, they will be the ones with a more serious illness. So aggregating all our vaccination indicators together, where are we up to yesterday? A total of 22,627,000 doses have been administered. The total number of individuals who have been vaccinated, 15 million people have been vaccinated. That's about 38.5% of the adult population. So this is excluding the adolescents now. These are from 18-year-old upwards. The total population, including all children, all total population, that's about a quarter of the population have been vaccinated. The majority fully vaccinated, but some partially vaccinated. Fully vaccinated, 31.4% of the adult population above 18, and just over 20%, 21%, 1 in 5 of the total population. So we are a little bit way behind. We've got quite a way to go, certainly comparing to countries in the Northern Hemisphere. We're way, way behind what they've been able to achieve. So let's take a step back and let's look, where are we in South Africa? We've got an interesting combination because we've got low activity, in fact, the lowest since the pandemic started, very low activity, and also low vaccine coverage. And we need to kind of try and dissect and analyze why have we got this interesting combination of low activity and low vaccine coverage. So a number of people, and unfortunately also the anti-vaxxers, are pointing to what we call natural immunity. Natural immunity is the immunity you get after you've been infected. That's why it's called natural. You develop the infection, you recover from the infection, you develop an immune response, and that's what's called natural immunity. So this publication came out in August. It was a non-peer-reviewed journal, Med 14. It's a non-peer-reviewed journal. So in other words, it hasn't gone through a peer-reviewed process, and it's ready for rapid publication. It came from Israel, and they looked at the individuals who had reinfections, in other words, after being naturally infected, had natural immunity, what the number of individuals with reinfection versus the number of individuals who had breakthrough infections after being vaccinated. And they found that there was a significantly higher rate of breakthrough infections after vaccine-induced immunity as compared to reinfections after natural immunity. And they came to the conclusion, therefore, that natural immunity is a much better immunity than vaccine-induced immunity. And in fact, this really fits in with a number of infectious diseases. We look at, for example, measles as one example. You get a much better immunity after natural infection than you get after vaccine-induced immunity, measles. But I'll come just out to give you another perspective. But also what came out more or less about the same time in August this year, this is an actuarial projection, and I'll come to, well, how they did it, in fact, was looking at the excess deaths, the curves of the excess deaths. And remember what I mentioned last week is that the Medical Research Council, if they look at this curve of excess deaths, it's about 3 times that of the notified of the recognized COVID deaths. So COVID deaths were about 90,000, and the Medical Research Council said, well, actually, this true figure is about 270,000. So what they've done, they've taken these actuarial, the Medical Research Council figure of about 270,000, and working backwards of that, they kind of have back calculated that about 80% of South Africans will have had COVID and therefore should have natural immunity. Well, if that's the case, then we really overcome the pandemic and we can relax. But obviously, the story is not quite as simple as that. And I'll tell you why it's not quite as simple as that. I think that study from Israel has come into a lot of criticism. It was a non-peer-reviewed journal, and it came for a lot of criticism because the groups that they were comparing were probably not comparable groups. This is a study which was reported in the MNWR from the Center for Disease Control in the States. MNWR is a Morbidity and Mortality Weekly report, a recent one, about last week. And they looked at fairly comparable groups, hospitalized individuals, and they calculated that, in fact, unvaccinated people were in fact 5 times more likely to be infected than vaccinated people. So they in fact showed the very opposite, that vaccination in fact was a much better producer of immunity, that natural immunity, some people do get very good natural and durable natural immunity, but it's very unreliable. And that's the problem with natural immunity. This is a laboratory study. And if you look at these green dots over here, and you can see that these green dots represent the level of neutralizing antibodies measuring your immune response, neutralizing antibodies after vaccination as compared to after infection. So vaccine-induced immunity versus natural immunity. HCS is human convalescent serum. And you can see that the vaccine, in fact, gives you a much higher or significantly higher level of neutralizing antibodies. You can see it in this graph as well as over here. And this is not too surprising because the vaccine, very craftily, I think I mentioned in the previous meeting, that the vaccine has been so craftily designed Maybe in the future when I can explain, it's very, very interesting to give a much better immune response than in fact the natural virus does in natural immunity. And then also that 80% is really an artificially high figure. If we take samples of individuals and look for antibodies, in fact, we get nowhere near that figure. The top one is about 48.5% in blood transfusion, a sample from the blood transfusion bank, looking at the level of antibodies as a reflection in the population. This is another study and actively prospective where they looked going forward the percentage of antibodies. That'll vary from about 40 to 50%. So nothing like 80%. That's the one thing. The other thing, of course, is that measuring these antibodies doesn't necessarily tell you that these people who got antibodies are necessarily protected. Unfortunately, where we are at our state of knowledge now, we aren't absolutely sure what are the correlates of protection. Do these neutralizing antibodies, do they reflect immunity? Probably they contribute, but there are, and I think I've mentioned before, other parameters which also contribute to immunity. So unfortunately, we can't really at this stage rely on natural immunity being the answer why we have, at the moment, low level of activity. I think we've got low level of activity simply because we're in the interwave period. We've just come out of the third wave. We're at a low level at the moment, but I'll talk to that just now. So can we, in fact, kind of relax and say, look, we're at a very low level of activity. Even if our vaccine coverage is not so high, the population is pretty well protected anyway. Can we start lifting restrictions? And I want to take you back to last week, and apologies for repeating this, but I think it is worth repeating what I showed last week. That in the United Kingdom, and if you recall, the United Kingdom, they're just under 10 times the case adjusted per million population than what we had, and about nearly 3 times the deaths per million population than what we had. And of course, once they reached very high levels of vaccine coverage, they started lifting restrictions, and this was the consequence. A steep increase in the number of cases and also an increase in the number of deaths. So this is what happens if you do lift restrictions too soon, you do lift restrictions prematurely. And I want to just show you this graph. It's an interesting one because it actually plotted the extent in which the United Kingdom, which had probably the more severe epidemic than other European countries, how they kind of lifted various restrictions and the extent to which they lifted these restrictions. No longer wearing masks in public places, no longer avoiding public transport, where of course people are close together, often without masks, no longer avoiding large gatherings and socializing, no longer avoiding crowded spaces. So you're looking at all these kind of parameters, and you see how it's actually resulted when they did lift these restrictions in what happens in terms of the uptick of the epidemic. So I think just to summarize where we are at the moment, we are now, after our third wave, very low activity. We can keep it at this low activity. We can actually, I think most if not all of my colleagues agree, there will be a fourth wave. We don't quite know when. Most predictions are looking at the end of the year, the end of December, maybe going into January. But the longer we can kind of keep our behavior at a level which will prevent the circulation of the virus, we can delay that fourth wave, and we can also ameliorate that fourth wave. We don't know how severe it is. Probably the fourth wave is not going to be as severe as the third wave. But again, it'll depend on how avidly, how meticulously, how disciplinedly we keep those infection prevention, all those infection preventions. So I think I'll leave there and go now on to questions. I'm getting quite a lot of questions, and quite a few actually came in as well from the Board of Deputies with regard to the booster shots. So one person asked, they've got family members traveling to America. They are healthcare workers. Remember, healthcare workers were the first part of that study, that so-called Sasonki study of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So a lot of those people myself included, have been vaccinated quite a long time ago, some as early as February. And it is now time for them to get a booster. So this is in the planning. It's very imminent. I suspect probably in the next week or two, they will roll out the booster shots. It'll be what's called a homologous booster. It'll be the same vaccine, Johnson & Johnson vaccine now, as a booster shot for those healthcare workers. At a later stage, there may also be an offer of a Pfizer that's called heterologous boosting, two different vaccines, at a later stage to boost the initial Johnson & Johnson. So that's as far as the healthcare workers are concerned. There is a problem with traveling, and specifically a problem of traveling to Israel. Unfortunately, as things stand at the moment, the Israeli authorities are demanding that either one has been vaccinated within the last 6 months, or one has a third booster shot. Now, unfortunately, in South Africa, you cannot get a third booster shot. The third booster shot's being reserved for people whose immune systems are compromised, immunocompromised individuals, and of course also for the healthcare workers, as I mentioned just now, but not for the general public. So unfortunately, you will not be able to get that third booster shot, and this is a problem. It's a problem in terms of traveling to Israel. There are apparently, I heard, making some exceptions, obviously compassionate exceptions, maybe for group travel. I think just contact, if you are in that space, contact the Israel Center to find out what the latest, but the latest that I've got is that there is that problem. That problem does exist. Then I did get a question. I'll have to look it up. I haven't got a ready answer. And this question is asking, why is there a discrepancy between the figures which are published by the Premier of the Western Cape versus the numbers that are on the government website? The Western Cape, they published 5,500, whereas the government, the other way around, the Western Cape is publishing 1,822 cases. The government website is 5,500 and increasing. I look it up. I don't have the ready answer for that. I'm not sure who's being sampled by, where the Western Cape get their figures. I can certainly comment on the government side. Those are the figures that come from what's called the DATCOV, data of COVID, which the NICD plots from various sources, from hospital admissions, from laboratory data, and so on. So certainly the government site would be an accurate one that I can confirm. Where the Western Cape get their figures, I'll have to look up and come back in a future date. But what I do want to say is that I will not be here for next week. I am taking a bit of a rest next week, and I'll be in the bush, and I might not have a Wi-Fi contact, so I will not have an update next week. And the next midweek update will then be on Wednesday, the 17th. So look after yourselves and have a good 2 weeks. See you in 2 weeks' time. All the best. Bye.